So now we're going to move on and look at some communication theories, barriers, and the evaluation of communications. So you've just watched the video. Yes, a comedy situation, but there was definitely some confusions and barriers there to their effective communication. That comical situation, though, could easily be contextualized into workplace. A manager giving someone instructions for a task, someone ordering or requesting something from another department and it being misunderstood. Did you note down any sort of reasons or particular things that you thought were the reasons why we were having that confusion or those barriers? Well, I sort of noted a few, and we're going to talk about them, but I thought about things like the culture or the background, and by that I mean between the worker and the storekeeper. There was accent and dialect problems. There were also things about people calling things different, their different knowledge or their different levels or understanding of things. And also, the list was a very mixed message, jumping around from one thing to another. So although we probably wouldn't do it like that in the workplace, it's an exaggeration for comic effect. But it did start to highlight some points. We've looked at the skills needed for the interpersonal skills and how we can detail and use those by selecting appropriate types and techniques of communication. And now we need to consider, even after that, what barriers there could be to affecting communication. And first we'll examine some communication theories because they lead in nicely into barriers, and then we'll talk about how we evaluate our communication. But let's have a look at the aims for this session. So the overall aim is continuing from the previous session, and that's understand different forms and techniques of communication and how to apply them appropriately. But by the end of this session, we should be able to explain how to overcome barriers to effective communication in the workplace, describe how to evaluate the effectiveness of communication within a team organisation, and evaluate the use of different communication forms in different contexts. So we're going to have a look at communication theories, and we're not here to look at them in detail and examine them all. We're just here to use a couple just to focus on how we can look at barriers that come up. And the first one we're going to look at is known as the mother of all models, really, commonly known by that name. It's the Shannon-Weaver model. And it was done as a mathematical theory about communication when Bell systems were sort of introducing telephones. So it was produced using the basis of technology at the time, which was the old telephone system. But it's been used as the basis, and that's why it's called the mother of all models, because it's the basis and been adapted and added to. And the first thing that you can see on this model shown on the screen is the first bit that was added later was that feedback loop from the receiver to the transmitter, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later, but feedback is now acknowledged as a key part of the communication process. Remembering that the model was developed in the 1940s around the telephone, but we can still see the process of it. We've got info source or sender, so that's the person who wants to send the message, and the message is then transmitted or encoded. Now, in telephone days, that would have been into binary data or into some sort of signal. It is then sent across, the signal is received and decoded so that the message can be delivered to its final destination. We can now sort of replace that in modern day with saying that the info is the sender, the transmitter, everything within the channel is the method chosen, so it's how they decide to send that message and code it up, how it is decoded at the other end by whoever's receiving it, and whether they have the same code as the person who encoded it at the beginning, and then it reaches its final destination. And when we were talking about the old days in the 1940s, the noise that's shown in the middle would have been probably static on the line or problems with the signal. But nowadays we can talk about that as noise that's going on in the workplace. So that could be distractions, that could be other people getting involved, it could be a busy workplace, anything that can be causing us a problem with trying to receive the message clearly. Another common model is Berlow's SMCR model, developed in the 1960s on the back of Shannon-Weaver model, and focused on the factors of the individual components that could make communication more effective and efficient. The model describes those four components as the sender, the message, the channel, and the receiver, and you can see that they all link from Shannon and Weaver. And each of those components has a set of factors that may affect how well it's going to work, and we can talk about those as barriers. So those factors are individual to each element. So for the sender, the factors are things such as the comm skills of the sender. Have they got good communication skills? What is their attitude? Are they interested, bothered? Are they even trying to make sure the message is getting across? What is their knowledge of the topic? We saw that in the two Ronnies, different knowledges, different levels. And what is the social structure? Again, maybe in the two Ronnies we saw that. And then finally, what is the culture of the organisation? How are they feeling? What does it make them feel? And then moving on to the message. What is the actual content of the message? And how has the elements been treated? Have they been given regard or importance? Has it got some sort of structure? We saw in the two Ronnies how it was going from one thing to another, and that was causing confusion. And then the code, is it understood by people in different places and different levels, or is it being coded differently? So again, in the two Ronnies, misconceptions about what they were talking about, what they were actually describing. And then the channel. What channel has been chosen to send the message? Does it involve hearing, seeing, touching, smelling, tasting? You know, we talked about before about choosing the right form of communication. And then finally, back to the receiver, which are the same factors as we've got at the sender, because this is where someone is taking on board the message that's been output by the sender. So do they match up? And if they don't match up, that's a potential barrier. So in those models, we can start to see where there are opportunities for barriers to cause problems to our effective communication. But another thing we need to take into account as well is what they call synchronous and asynchronous communication. So synchronous being at the same time, time dependent, where you're both synchronized in the same time. So a face-to-face, a telephone, a video conference, where you're actually talking to the person when they're ready to receive, and you're expecting them to receive it and respond to you and then receive. So we continue to synchronous communicate in that conversation. That differently to asynchronous, where you send something and wait, like an email or a text. You can send it at any time. The receiver doesn't need to be ready for you to send it. You don't know if the person's logged on when you send them an email, and then they respond when they're ready at any time, and again await a response. So it is time dependent, and it's constantly waiting for the next respondent to take up the message and respond. And I think sometimes people get muddled up and they get frustrated. They send an email and they expect an automatic response, thinking it's a synchronous communication, not realizing that, although they do know, but they don't realize. And that's because they've chosen the wrong method of communication. If you need something time dependent, then you're not going to go with asynchronous communication. Well, in looking at those models and asynchronous and synchronous communication and all the other bits we've talked about the choices we make, hopefully you've started to see where some barriers could exist and what we need to do about them. But we can categorize those barriers into some sort of key areas, really. And the first is physical. Is there a separation in location? We talked about that in remote teams in Unit 500, how it can be different when someone's remote. What about the working culture and the environment? What is the culture around communication? What is the perceptions by audiences of the message giver? You know, for the management, for example, have they stopped listening to communication? Is the environment confrontational? And then we've got status of the audience and the sender. What's the difference in the status? Could it be an issue? Could someone else deliver it? Is there someone who is more in tune with the audience? And then cultural differences, that could be national or regional. It could just be that people are not aware of things, or they're not as they would expect them, and that can cause a barrier straight away, and could create resentment or confusion. And then language, which is that sort of real cultural barrier, but it could be jargon or terminology. We should never be presumptuous that people understand things. There could be psychological state, there could be emotions, personal triggers, past histories, recent incidents that can just cause a barrier or a conflict. So we need to be aware of those when we talk about knowing your audience. It could be systemic, a lack of clarity in the comms system. if people aren't sure about the way the information is normally transmitted in the organisation, or things aren't being transmitted systematically as they would expect them, then they can be confused. Or it could be attitudinal, low levels of motivation, resistance to change if that's going on, resistance to a new culture, and it can just cause the meaning to be unclear and the communication to be difficult. And what can we do about these barriers? Well, there's many things that we can do, and we've started to talk about some of them already, and we've covered things in 513. We're looking at our self-awareness, and we've talked about it in building relationships. But let's have a look at a couple and see how they can sort of build to try and change some of these barriers and make our communication more effective. The first is to have some clarity of thoughts. Are you sure and very clear about what the messages you're trying to get across? Do you know what you want to convey? Is it arranged in a logical order that will communicate accordingly? Think about the 4 candles where everything was all over the place, because a clarity of thought and a systematic approach will make it easier for people to receive. We want to sort of get away from any aimless chat or babble that might deter people from listening properly to the message. And then part of that is knowing your audience. You should have some sort of empathy towards the receiver, be sensitive to their thoughts and emotions. You need to recognise and acknowledge their levels, their behaviour, the culture of the people you're talking to. It's all going to help them understand, and it makes it more of a cooperation in understanding the message rather than it just being something that you're blasting at them. You want to make sure that they're included and that you've recognised the structure, the level, their ability, and if, for example, if it's a message to a layman, then it's in layman's terms. And as part of that, we may need to take some advice before communicating. Talk to people who might know about the audience, etc., if you're not sure. And then we need to be mindful of the way we're speaking. Respect the tone, the pitch, the language. Remember the videos we looked at before talking about speaking to make people listen. A polite tone and manner encourages listeners. Keep your sentences short and simple. Vary your voice. You want to keep the interest of the receiver. Keep them in front of your mind, changing your speed, using your language to sort of excite people when you want them to and to make them take notice. Remember the audience body language, read that and change if you think that they're not reacting properly to your language. And then remember feedback. We talked about it being important when we were looking at the communication models and how it was added later. So seek and take and receive feedback, and they're different things. Ask your audience about what you have said, the aspects that they've grasped in your message. If you don't think they are, then you could be asking them questions. Be polite. It involves your listener as well and makes them feel part of it rather than being talked to. And it gives clues to the aptitude and interest they are showing in the topic and the message you're putting across as well. And try and be consistent with your message. Make sure your message matches in with the organisational cultures, goals, and the local policies, procedures. But if it's not going to, if you're going to be doing something different, it's going to be a change, make sure they know that at the beginning and there's no doubts, and then they won't expect it. You can do that by checking and evaluating the communication system processes with the strategies, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then be aware of your own body language. We've talked about theirs, but be aware of your own. Make sure you've got the right body language. And then don't overload people with too much information. Remember and think and empathise about how much other information they've got to take on board. So think about how important it is. And that leads into reducing noise. In the Shannon and Weaver model, we looked at that noise where it said it could be from within the telephone system, interference, etc. Well, here the interference could be physical, in that you may be in an environment where there's lots going on. So if the message is important, take them out of that environment, make sure they can concentrate. Or it might be mental, it might be other noises, other work that's going on. So try and minimise what you can to reduce the noise so that your message is heard loud and clear. Try and keep the chain short. We talked about the chain when we talked about formal and informal communications. So try and make sure where possible that you avoid sending communications through a third party unless it's unavoidable, it's urgent. Where possible, communicate directly with the people, that you want to communicate with, so that there's no Chinese whispers, there's no chance of it miscoding as it goes down the chain. Communicate directly and you'll have much more chance of the final receiver getting your message. And then finally, be in control of yourself. Do not show any aggression or frustration or anger if these things aren't solving your barriers. You need to make sure that, as we talked about in 513-400, that you know your triggers and you can keep yourself in control. You need to state your thoughts politely, stick to the facts, use summary and reflection, and remain positive as you go through, not like in the two Ronnies where in the end he just lost it and handed over to someone else. So, we've just looked at barriers, possible ways to mitigate them and deal with them, and one of those was consistency of message in line with organisational culture, communications, policy, strategy, and we need to evaluate that to know. So why bother evaluating? We might presume that everything is going well, everybody's doing what they're told, things are getting done, but presumption can be dangerous. Poor comms can lead to departments not coordinating with each other, a culture of gossip, and a high stress, low satisfaction sort of culture. And these things can creep up really suddenly, and then we suddenly wonder where they came from. What's happening? Everything was going so well, but we've just taken our eye off the ball. And with communication being so important, we cannot afford to do that. Much better to be thinking about what we could be doing better. Could we be communicating better? Are we communicating as well as we thought we were? Because effective communication leads to success. Effectiveness, efficiency, higher morale, better productivity, and a thriving working environment where people want to flourish and people are happy and they enjoy their work because they understand what's going on and they feel engaged with the communication, so that everybody knows where they stand, what they're doing, and how it's being done. Because things don't stand still, they're constantly changing, so we need to be constantly evaluating as the company expands, as culture is changing, as there's an impact of technology on our communications, which we've mentioned, or we've got new staff being dropped in, or management structures changing. We need to be making sure that we're constantly evaluating these to make sure that our communication is still working. And where might we get information for that evaluation? It's there. There's lots of it there all the time. We've got staffing surveys, looking at people's emotions, their understanding of what's going on, their general staff sort of happiness. Consumer surveys, customer surveys, how staff are communicating with them, how they are getting the information across about the messages we're trying to put across through our communications. Evaluation reports on events and staff meetings, training, etc. Feedback from staff just informally, just in general, informal conversation as we talked about before. Supervision and feedbacks, if we've got a framework in there that we've talked about before and that framework has got communication skills, interpersonal skills in there for their role, their team, then that can help us. Customer feedback, reported satisfaction errors and issues if they're an area that we've been trying to get across in a message somewhere. Appraisals and supervisions, those regular contacts we should be having with our staff, where we're getting a chance to talk about their competence and their behaviours against those frameworks again. And then finally, learning and development, communication skills that are required. Think about the survey that we did on your communication skills, using those sort of things to check where people feel they're going, what they feel their understanding is of their current levels. In general, we can evaluate our communication using a quote that I always keep in the front of my mind, which is, judge your communication by the response that you get. And to me, that really says it all. So we need to be reflecting on things like body language. What's the response we're getting, reading it as we're speaking or as we're sending things out if it's face-to-face, and changing. What are the number of questions that we're receiving? Are we getting lots of questions. Now that can be a positive or a negative if they're positive questions and people are trying to find out more information, but then we could be thinking, are we not giving enough in the first place? But are they understanding and seeking further information, expansion, or are they just simplistically asking things, can you go through again, what do you mean? And then we have to start thinking about our own communication, because the response we're getting isn't very good, therefore it's probably our own communication that's causing the problem. The next is ask questions to check their understanding. Use questioning to take a reading of what's getting through and what they're understanding. It's also a great way of getting them involved. And if you're using activities or training, are they understanding the context that you're using it in? Are they contextualizing it correctly? And then what is the speed of the communication transfer that you're getting? Are you expecting them to pick it up quicker or something, or is it slower than you were anticipating? So that might be a case of reviewing and evaluating how you're communicating. But taking that a stage further, when we're talking about judging organizational or team communications, internal communications, we could be judging things in different categories, such as outputs to what inputs we're getting, what the uptake is, what immediate outcomes we're getting, and what final outcomes we're getting, as we can see in this table. Let's just look up one example in there. For example, the measure could be the number of management meetings, staff briefings, staff training events, and then the inputs that we're getting are the number of managers attending or the number of staff attending, the uptake, their thoughts and what they're recognizing as the messages. Did they like the event? What was their change in their attitude, whatever we're trying to do? And then the immediate outcomes, how many of those managers, for example, who are having management meetings are then holding meetings with their teams? How many staff have attended the training sessions that were required, and are we up to enough of the numbers, whatever judgment we've made? And then the final outcome is whether it's making difference to that specific project, that process or reform. So there's an article or paper giving more details on this, but we should be measuring against those things. What's the output? Because it's great, you see these places where people say, oh yeah, we have regular meetings, so and so and so and so, and yet no one's attending them, or people are attending them but they don't like them, so they've been enforced coming to them, or they're attending them and then the outcomes of that is nothing's getting passed on. So it really is a case of making a judgment about, at different stages, is that communication message getting through, and is our communication performing as effectively as it should. Right then, so we're drawing to an end for this unit now. We've got a quick activity to come, and then I'll explain to you about what we do next. But our overall aims for the sessions 1 and 2 were to understand interpersonal skills, and the next was to understand different forms and techniques of communication and how we can apply them appropriately. So in the first session we looked at interpersonal skills and how they're used within the relationships. We looked at the different forms of communication that can help and hinder the communication process, and we described a range of techniques that we could apply. In this session we've just been through some barriers that could affect communication in the workplace. As part of that, we looked at some of the models that we could use, communications models, and how those impacted on it. We looked at how we can evaluate communication, and we've been talking about judging your message by the response that you get, and then we talked about some organizational sort of things. And part of the activity we're going to do is we're going to start to look at the different forms of communication with your organization, how you think things are within your organization. So that'll be about evaluating your organization. So we're going to look at how we're going to do that activity. So it's all about evaluating the performance of your organization's communications, really. So I want you to consider your organization or your department team against those performance measures we talked about. So you'll be looking at the inputs that you put in, the outputs you get, what the uptake is like, what the initial sort of outcomes are, and what the final outcome is. You'll be looking at how it's measured and what data is recorded and what the outcomes are from the information and what it's used for. Now, if this is identifying that some of these things are not happening within your organization, then this is your chance to start talking about how they could be improved, and maybe then you could use some of those things to go into your PDP if it's about your team or your role. There's more on some of the areas about evaluation and improving your communication in the resources, but you can also do your own research. So complete that activity. There's a worksheet for it. Complete that activity and upload it for your assessor to assess, and then we'll look at what you need to do after that. So once you've completed your final activity and uploaded it, this unit is assessed by an ILM externally set assignment. Be scenario based as with the other ones, and there's 4 tasks covering the whole of the areas across this unit of 503 communication, mainly based around interpersonal skills, using them and applying them in communication techniques. So you can read the scenario. Now, when you're going to do this assessment will be agreed with you and your assessor, but you can also start looking at the guidance for Unit 307, which is the skills element of communication where you'll need to produce the evidence. So if you look at that skills unit, there is a guidance sheet in there telling you about the areas that you need to provide evidence of, and you can plan those and discuss those with your assessor. Anything that's come up in this unit where you're thinking, oh, I need to improve on that, I can develop that, I need to evaluate that, do some reflection and include it in your PDP, because remember, as part of 513-400, we're meant to be keeping this going throughout the qualification. And then once all that's completed and you've agreed all that, the next unit is 514, problem solving and decision making.